going to give a very different kind of a talk from Leon's talk, which was more of an overview. And I want to focus a little bit on some core algorithmic questions in this kind of realm of big data, massive data, modern massive data, whatever you want to call it. And I'm going to focus this around this work, which is together with some colleagues at Google. And we're going to attack a very simple question of just counting the number of connected components in very large graphs. But before I begin, I want to kind of jump in and say, what is it that we care about? And a lot of the speakers yesterday alluded to these questions and to these kind of problems and these things you have to be always cognizant of when you're dealing with large data algorithmics. And just to remind you, kind of, Dan in particular talked about communication and how much communication is important, how much do we care, and to both analyze and to limit the number of communication that we're working with in large-scale distributed systems. And together with communication comes data skew, that one of the kind of underlying properties of large data is that it's not uniformly distributed. It was not generated by some kind of uniform distribution or by some nice distribution. Usually it's very, very skewed. So a very small part of your data accounts for a large chunk of the work that you're going to do. And avoiding this kind of is something that you have to work hard at so that your algorithms actually finish and you see your results before the end of the hour, before the end of the day, before the paper deadline. So what it comes down to is that really what do I want to focus on with algorithms? There's a lot of talk of embarrassingly parallel algorithms, but nobody really talks about the fact that some of these embarrassingly parallel algorithms are also embarrassingly slow when they're run in real life. And this is kind of what's highlighted yesterday with the triangle counting approaches, that there's many different ways to do triangle counts, and the naive way that you're going to do, the first thing that comes to your mind if you sit down and implement it, is the wrong way. And just because it is embarrassingly parallel doesn't mean that we shouldn't spend time thinking about it and trying to figure out how to make it even better. Right? And what are we thinking about? We're really thinking about minimizing communication and minimizing the skew that we're going to have. So with this kind of lens in mind, let's talk about connected components. So I think everybody knows what connected components are. I'm going to give you a large graph. It's going to be undirected. We're going to take the easiest case in the world. And I just ask you, how many different components are there? Right? Seemingly very, very simple. And in case if the graph is not very large, we have many different ways of doing it. And even if the graph is moderately large, we'll already have many, many different algorithms on this. This problem is kind of decades old in computer science and even older than that in mathematics in general. And we have algorithms in your favorite model of computation, be it just a RAM, be it a PRAM, be it MapReduce, be it Pregel, be it kind of asynchronous systems like GraphLab. There's no shortage of algorithms for this problem. And why is that important? Why there are all these different kind of algorithms developed? Well, it's a subroutine for almost anything that you want to do with a graph. If you can't tell me the number of connected components in a graph, you can't begin to talk about clustering, you can begin to talk about spanning trees, cuts, and everything else that you want to do. Right? Now, why am I here talking about yet another algorithm? And here I want to focus on really large graphs. And this is something where a lot of these methods work, but maybe they're not as efficient as they can be. So what do I mean by really large graphs? So to me, really large graphs are graphs that don't fit on your disk, much less in memory. So when what I want to talk about is multi-terabyte sized graphs, right? You're talking about billions of nodes, hundreds of billions of edges. And so you just can't fathom for maybe another few years of putting them in memory. Now you might say, well, Sergei, you can wait a few years and things will get better, but then these graphs will grow. And so we're always stuck kind of playing catch up. Good, so what is going to be our approach? So the approach is going to be simple. I'm going to take this large graph, whatever it is, and I'm going to transform it so that it's just a union of stars. Because if your graph is a union of stars with one star for every component, I'm going to argue that it's very simple to count how many stars you have. Right? Whereas if your graph looks nasty and gnarly and complicated, then you have no idea how many components there are. So this is what we're going to get to. right? And how do we begin? We begin the same way that we always begin. We're kind of doing connectivity, so we have this graph. This is going to be my large graph for the moment, 9 nodes. We're going to assign IDs arbitrarily to every single node, right? But how we're going to proceed given this, so I told you about transformations that we're going to do to the graph. There's going to be 2 kinds of transformations, and both of them are going to be local. So I'm going to look at a node, I'm going to look at the node and its neighbors, and then I'm going to decide which edges to keep or which edges to create so that they appear in the next iteration, and otherwise I'm going to drop edges. Right, so I'm given a graph, and I'm going to compute a new graph, create a new graph on the same nodes but with a different set of edges, and eventually I'm going to coalesce into something that looks like the union of stars. So this is where we're going. Right? So here's the first operation, and I'm going to describe it in a number of different ways. And we'll see what it does. So the operation is the following. So I have a node. So this blue node in the middle, 8. I'm going to look at its larger neighbors, colored in red, and its smallest neighbor, colored in green. And I'm going to say connect its larger neighbors to the smallest neighbor that it has. Right? So it's 8. Because 9 is the only larger neighbor, 1 is the minimum, I'm going to add this edge. So I'm going to do this operation in parallel on every single node, and this will create a new graph for me. So I'm not keeping the edges from the past iteration. I'm going to be creating a whole new graph altogether. So what does this look like? So we have our very large graph. It spans most of the slide. We have now the set of nodes, and I'm going to be creating a new one in the next iteration. So we already know what happens when I do it, when I execute this process at 8, I look at 1 and 9, and I add this edge around it. Now, if I look at 7, I'm looking for the larger nodes. 8, I'm looking for the minimum neighbor 3, so I'm going to add the 8 to 3 edge. If I look at 5, it itself is the minimum neighbor that it has, and its only larger neighbor is 8, so I add another edge in particular. And I keep on doing this. I add an edge. If I look at 9, it has no larger neighbors, so I don't add any edges with respect to it. And if you do this on the remainder of the nodes, you can trust me that you get a graph that looks like this. Now you might ask, have we made any progress going from here to here? I'm going to say yes, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But before we make this progress, it's interesting to note that the graph remains connected. Right? So I haven't changed the connectivity structure of the whole graph. This may not be obvious if I was kind of sitting here, because I have these 4 edges that are connected to 8, and I created one edge 1 to 9. And you might ask yourself, how is it that I've kept the connectivity overall here? Right. So there's a proof. We can go through the proof, but we can go through a different set of intuition which will make this proof almost unnecessary. So what is this intuition? Suppose I take all the edges that I have and I orient them from larger nodes to smaller nodes, larger IDs to smaller IDs. Right? So 9 points to 8, 8 points to 1, 8 points to 5, etc. What does this large star operation means? It means look at your children. So these are the nodes that are larger than you. And tell them to connect to your parent directly. Right? To the minimum parent that you have. So 8 has 3 parents here. Look at the minimum parent that you have and tell them to connect directly. This is all that you're doing. So now, why does the graph remain connected? Well, imagine that you have this connected graph. Every node says, hey, if I'm not the root, let me look at the children and tell them to skip one step over and connect one step up. Right? Now it's kind of trivial that I've preserved the connectivity, that nothing's going to change. I hope it's at least trivial. Right? There is a proof, it's in the slides. We can talk about it later. But this should be easy. But what have I done also? Or when does this operation stop? Now it's very clear to see when does this operation stop. Well, it stops when there's a node that doesn't have both children and parents. Because if there's a node that has both a child and a parent, then in the next iteration it'll take its children and tell them to connect directly and bypass it. right? So this is now a fixed point. A fixed point is going to be when there are no smaller nodes. When it's a DAG and it has a height of 2. And I can talk now also about progress that we make. And I hope this statement is now going to be pretty obvious. So what does this statement say? How many times can I do this operation before I finish? Well, it's going to be a logarithmic number of times in the number of nodes. Why? Because every single time I have a particular height and I'm reducing the height by a constant factor. Right? So after a log number of rounds, I'm going to be done, and in the sense that I'm going to be in this fixed point state. Good. So I'm going to go from something that looks like this to something that looks like this. Now, we can sort of argue whether this looks closer to a star than that did. This is a philosophical argument we can argue for a long time. But now I'm going to talk about a different operation. So we had this large star that we talked about. There's going to be a small star involved as well. So what does small star look like? It's almost like it sounds. I'm going to look at smaller neighbors than me. So I'm, again, node 8. I'm going to look at myself and the smaller neighbors and connect them to the minimum root. Right? And so 8 is connected to 1, 7, 5. They're all connected to 1 rather than to itself. Right? And we can, again, rebuild the graph as to what it's going to look like. So if I'm looking from the point of view of 9, 1 is the smaller neighbor, so I'm going to connect 9 to 1. From the point of view of 1, it has no smaller neighbors, so there's nothing to do. From the point of view of 8, we had this example before, and so on. And so now this is the graph that I'm going to get after the transformation. So again, there is an interpretation if we orient the edges the right way. So what is the interpretation here? Now I'm going to tell all the parents that I have to connect to the minimum parents. So now the node 8 has 3 parents. It has 1, 5, and 7. And it's going to say, hey, I have a number of parents. Let's connect all of them to the minimum one that I have. Right? And this is what's going to turn out here. Now, with this interpretation, again, I don't need to tell you that this preserves connectivity. Right? I had some parents, and they were connected through me before. Now they're connected directly, and I'm connected to one of them as well. So connectivity is preserved. And I can make another progress style of a claim. So what is the progress here? If I was in this fixed point where my depth was only 2, I had some number of root nodes. This operation then reduces the number of root nodes altogether by a constant factor. So then between, if I then again run all the way and go to a depth 2 DAG, my total number of root nodes has reduced by a constant factor. Right? This is a little bit harder to see, but it's the same algebra. Okay. And so what does this lead me to in the end? Is that I have a very simple algorithm for connectivity that's local, that says every node just looks at its surrounding, and it looks something like this. So I'm going to have an inner loop that has this LargeStar component that says reduce the height of my tree, and an outer loop that's going to run SmallStar once, which says reduce the total number of level 0 nodes in my DAG. And I keep on doing this, and I can guarantee that this converges on log squared n rounds. Question?
Do you inflate the number of edges at any point?
We'll get to that. Hold on that question for just a few minutes. Right, so why does the algorithm converge in log squared again? Well, the number of root nodes decreases by a constant factor every single time, every single outer phase, and the inner phase takes at most log steps as well. Right? And this is where I get the log squared overall. How do we implement this? So if there's many different ways, and I like the fact that this algorithm is kind of system agnostic. If you want to run it on kind of a Pregel or Giraffe style system, you can do it easily. If you want to do it on the MapReduce style system, you can do this easily as well. Right? Everything decomposes very nicely. I know exactly who I'm communicating with. I know exactly how much data I'm going to ingest, and so on. So now to the question. The question was, does the number of edges increase during the operation? And in fact, we can prove something slightly, the answer is no. And we can prove that the number of edges never increases, and typically will decrease as you go forward, right? So you start with some complicated graph. In the end, I'm going to end up with a union of stars, so I'm going to end up with a forest. So it's clear that in the end, the number of edges is smaller. The question, what happens in the middle? And an important consideration here is that the number of edges does decrease, and this helps quite a bit with the communication running times, because my communication actually decreases as I go forward. I'm only keeping the edges that remain relevant as long as I can, as long as they're relevant. So in the last kind of 10 minutes, I want to talk about making this algorithm practical and different considerations that we can do. So I have an overall algorithm. It has some nice properties. Right? If I were to actually implement this, and we did implement it, what do I care about? How do I make the next step? So the first approach is more of a systems approach. So what does the approach say? It says, I am doing this LargeStar operation. What is the point of it? The point of it is I have some DAG that's pretty tall, and I want to shrink it to a DAG of height 2. Right? So for every node, I'm really following a path to one of the root nodes that it's connected to. And I can do this faster. There's no reason. I can do this in many different ways. I can do this kind of one round at a time, and I can do this one hop at a time approach. I can do the short-cutting approach that we're doing, so now it's kind of log of the height. But I can also say, if the graph doesn't change, I'm going to do a form of path compression, and I'm just going to look it up and say, who do I connect to in the very end? Right? And so if I have access to a distributed hash table that says for every node, I record who the parent is, and now for every node, and this is stored in my hash table, and now I'm just going to follow the links in the hash table all the way to the root, this is something that I can do as well. This requires very little communication because I'm just following this path, and then I compress and I have this DAG presented to me. Now this assumes that you have a DHT implementation on hand that's nearby, that lives in the same data center, that all is connected and nice. I have one on hand. You may or may not have one on hand, but it's a useful thing to have. Right? Another approach is more of an algorithmic approach. And this will lead to an open question at the bottom of the slide. So right now we say run one of these guys to completion, then do another operation, then again do the first operation to completion until you hit a steady state, and so on and so forth. And we showed that this takes at most log squared n steps. I can also give you example graphs where this takes at least log squared n steps. So kind of in the worst case, you cannot approve this algorithm and analysis. But you can say, well, it looks like I'll just interleave these two. It seems like it's going to do the right thing. Right? So I'll just do an kind of first connecting my parents together, then connecting my children to my parents, and I'm just going to interleave these two one after another. It seems to work. We can prove formally that this converges, which is not at all obvious, actually, once you do this. And it appears to converge even faster than what we have. And in fact, it breaks the lower bound example that we have of log squared n. So we think that this is a log n rounds algorithm. We can't prove it. The dependencies get tricky, and we can't actually analyze it very nicely. So if you can prove a log n, if you can prove better than log n, then definitely come and talk to me. If you can prove log n, then also come and talk to me, because we've spent some time on this, and we couldn't quite do it. OK. So one other thing that I want to talk about is that I mentioned Skew in the very beginning. And you should...
Before you vote, so did you run this?
Yeah.
Do you have the result?
We'll get to it. I have 5 more minutes. So I want to talk about Skew. So you should be worried, kind of the interruption that I was hoping to get, is to say, well, Sergei, in the very end, you're wanting to get a union of stars. If your graphs are very large, and maybe there's only just a single component, then really what you're going to get is a star where there's a single node and everybody connected to it. And now you have the star of degree of a few billion or even more, and that's just not good. Nothing scales to that effect, at least naively. Right? And even if your graph is not a single component, this is a real world graph, it's going to have one giant component, which might as well be in the billions of nodes and everything else. Right, so here there's a simple, for this particular algorithm, there's a simple fix that we can do. And this simple fix says, what do we need this big star for? We need it for computing the minimum neighbor that I have. That's really the main thing that I care about. Because everything else is kind of telling my children to connect to this minimum neighbor, but I need to find the minimum. Finding the minimum is something that we know how to distribute. We know how to do it well. We know how to do it easily. This is how you do it pictorially. But if I were to ask you to do it, you would do the same thing. Right? And here we get a trade-off. We can blow up the number of rounds that we're going to have, because now in the end, we're really not going to have a union of stars. We're looking for a low-depth tree, right, with bounded degree at every step. And so we have a trade-off between how much do you want to bound the degree because of memory and communication concerns, and how much do you care about the number of rounds. And the trade-off is pretty simple and straightforward. Right. So now to the implementation question. So there's a question, does this actually work? Right? So we ran this on a whole bunch of different graphs. I'm going to give you a subset of 4. These are the first 3 are kind of medium to large size, but they're not really gigantic. So 300 million nodes, 4 billion edges. This is large, but this is not obscenely large. Right? This is kind of the Twitter graph that everybody talks about. Yes, it's large. We have larger ones. For the sake of kind of argument, the live journal graph that a lot of people have used previously as a large graph is something that I can probably run on my phone. At that point, I don't think we can consider it a real example of a very large graph. But we did for stress testing, we have this document similarity graph. It doesn't really matter where it comes from. It's about kind of 5 billion nodes, 500 billion edges as an order of magnitude, kind of something to stress test and run this on. What are the algorithms that we ran this? We ran this with a lot more. We can talk about the other details. There was an algorithm that appeared a couple of years ago that sort of showed that this is for MapReduce implementations. It was a state-of-the-art approach. And then we have 2 algorithms that we compared. One is if you have a distributed hash table on hand, right? And this is going to be the DHT implementation. And then the other one is this alternating algorithm that I talked about, where you do one, then the other. Right? And we have both the optimized version, where you break up and limit the degree of each star, and the non-optimized version, where you say, yes, it's going to take a much longer time, but I'm just going to wait, because I want to see how much does this optimization actually help. What is the setup, and what are we comparing? So the setup is that it's just a loaded production cluster. We're going to run this several times, look at the median running time. And what are we comparing? We're going to compare the running time with respect to this hash to min state of the art that we had, right? And so what I'm going to talk to you is about speedups over the baseline. And now this is something that's independent of the number of machines that you have, how loaded your cluster is, and everything else. And we controlled for all of these as much as we can, as much as we could. So what do you see? So again, the y-axis is speedups. And the black line is at 1. So this says no speed up at all. On smaller graphs, so this is the UK graph, the live journal graphs, the Twitter graph was similar to this. Well, the live journal graph was similar to this. You get almost no speed up. Right? You get a little bit, the blue one is a little bit bigger, the red one's a tiny bit bigger, etc. Right? And this says we're not hitting the performance limitations of previous algorithms. If this is the size of the graph, the previous algorithms work quite well. We can do better, but not crazy better. If we look at very large graphs, so again, this document similarity is 500 billion edges, here we're getting nice separation between everything, right? Pure alternating algorithm gives you a slight speed up of what you had before, and we'll talk about why in a second. But if you do this degree-bounded optimization, which you have to do now, you're getting an extra 10x speed up, essentially. Right? And if you have access to a DHT on hand, you get another 2x. So you go from about 20 to about 40. And so this talks about kind of towards this goal that I had in the beginning, that there are algorithmic optimizations that you can do, but there are also system optimizations that you can do. So it depends on what are you trying to achieve with kind of the algorithms and the large data processing that you're doing. Right? You can attack it in both ways. Both of the ways are useful. Both of the ways get you further up this chart. Right? Now, why why is it that we get a speed up even on smaller graphs? And this is now kind of back to this question of the number of edges. So this is taking one of the synthetic graphs that we had, and I'm plotting the iteration, and on the y-axis, log of the number of edges in the graph. So what you want to see is something that's decreasing, right? This says I'm converging towards a tree, and this says I've converged and now I'm in a tree state, right? What you don't want to see is something that goes up, because remember this is log scale. So this is, even if it goes up by a single unit, you've now doubled your number of edges, or you've tripled your number of edges, you've tripled your communication. And tripling your communication does not mean that your algorithm is 3 times slower. Usually it means it's a lot more than 3 times slower, right? And so because of the analysis and what we're doing, you're decreasing the number of edges in every step, and this is what helps you as well. Right? Good. So just to conclude, what did I talk about? I gave you a new algorithm. I said, here's a problem that we all know and love. I didn't talk about the 10 previous algorithms. I can talk to you, I can tell you about them in a lot more detail. But I wanted to claim that none of them actually solve the problem that we had if we're working on extremely large graphs and extremely large scenarios. Right? So we proved the log squared n. We can't prove a log n for the alternating case, although I think all of the co-authors agree that that's the right answer. Right? And really kind of the higher level takeaway is that I hear a lot about this kind of embarrassingly parallel algorithms, and maybe there's nothing to do because we can solve a lot of things, just decompose very nicely and we can solve them. But in reality, oftentimes they do decompose very nicely, but solving them is still a challenge, right? And they are embarrassingly slow for the resources that you have. If you're running something on 1,000 machines and it's taking more than an hour, something seems wrong fundamentally, right? Especially if it's only one of these machines that's a bottleneck and you're waiting for it to finish. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.